It was around 9:30 in the morning on September 11th, 1914, when able seaman Billy Williams was hit. He sank down on the road inland from Gallipoli, modern-day Papua New Guinea, struck down by either a German sniper or a member of the native police force. Williams would die from his injuries, becoming the first Australian casualty of the Great War. But the advance must continue. 5 more Australians would die that day, including Commanding Officer Charles Elwell. But the objective would be secured: the German wireless station at Bitapaka. The Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force were still thousands of miles from London and Berlin, but they were definitely in the fight. By October, they had their first major success. German New Guinea fell to Australian forces. Despite the loss of 39 lives, things were going well. This positivity, however, would not last. This is the story of Australia in World War I, a story that is so often dominated by actions at Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, and with good reason, but is, in fact, much richer and more wide-ranging than many people realize. Let's see where it takes us. Australian involvement in World War I does not begin at Gallipoli, nor does it end there. But the Dardanelles campaign still looms large over the Aussie experience of the Great War. In December of 1914, a new force came into being: the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, more popularly known as the Anzacs. The following spring, this corps would experience its first major action in the bloody, bitter, and ultimately futile fighting of the Dardanelles Straits. The initial naval campaign in February of 1915 failed to achieve its objectives, so a new strategy, masterminded in part by First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, was concocted. Amphibious landings would take place on the Gallipoli Peninsula, followed by a sweeping land campaign that would knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, make it easier to run supplies to the Russians on the Eastern Front, and expose Germany and Austria. At around 4 AM on April 25th, 1915, the first wave of troops landed at Anzac Cove, an area known locally as Adi Burnu. Perhaps confident of a swift victory, Australian, New Zealander, and Indian troops rushed ashore, where they were met by intense Turkish fire. Confusion reigned on the beaches. Some troops pushed inland, others were pinned down by the Ottoman resistance, taking massive casualties. By the end of the 25th, no units had reached their objectives, setting the tone for the remainder of the campaign. For almost a year, Entente troops attempted to force their way through the Ottoman lines, but to no avail. By the time of the withdrawal in January 1916, 8,709 Australians and 3,431 New Zealanders had lost their lives, dying thousands of miles from home in a land they had likely barely even heard of before. Thousands more were wounded, and the plight of these maimed soldiers is memorialized in Eric Bogle's The Band Played Waltzing Matilda. While factually inaccurate, Bogle's ballad offers a haunting reminder of the sacrifices made by men on both sides of the Gallipoli lines. As the Anzacs licked their wounds following the harrowing defeat in Gallipoli, the force was divided. Infantry divisions were progressively relocated from their base in Egypt to France, while cavalry units stayed behind. The Ottoman Empire now threatened British control in Egypt, and the Anzac Mounted Division would be deployed in the defense of Britain's North African territories. The biggest engagement occurred between August 4th and 12th around Romani in northern Sinai. Australian and New Zealand troops, alongside Indian, South Rhodesian and British units, took on a combined force of Ottoman, German and Austro-Hungarian troops, commanded by Friedrich Kress von Krechenstein. Initially victorious, the Entente troops pushed the Central Powers back eastwards, inflicting heavy casualties on von Krechenstein's forces. The Anzac forces would take the majority of the losses, sustaining 900 of the total 1,130 Entente casualties. Australian forces were also instrumental in the Palestine and Transjordan campaigns of 1917 and 1918, seeing action at Mughar Ridge, Ayun Kara, Jerusalem, Baghdad and Amman, among others, as the Ottoman Empire lurched toward disintegration. With the war now in its final bloody throes, Australian troops continued to fight with bravery and honour and take significant casualties, both here in the east and hundreds of miles away on the Western Front. July 1st, 1916. The now infamous first day of the Somme and one of the bloodiest single days in military history. While Australian troops were present along the line, having recently been deployed here from Egypt, they did not take part. They would have heard all about this slaughter though, a grim prelude of what was to come. Less than 3 weeks later, the Anzacs would have their turn. On July 19th, the Anzac 5th Division became the first to see action, advancing on German positions at Fromelles alongside the British 31st and 61st Divisions. The attack was a monumental catastrophe. Ordered over the top, the men fell in their dozens as they attempted to cross no man's land. Battered by artillery and raked by machine gun fire, few made it across the divide to the enemy trenches. Here, units such as the 184th Brigade found the barbed wire still intact and attempted to fall back. All of the Anzac 184th became casualties and all but 3 men lost their lives. Of just over 7,000 Entente casualties suffered in a single day of fighting, 5,553 were Anzac soldiers. Fromelles was the first Australian action on the Western Front, but it wouldn't be the last. Anzac troops fought at Bullecourt in March of 1917, and then at Messines in June and 3rd Ypres that autumn. They saw action during the desperate German Spring Offensive of early 1918 and in the decisive 100 days over that summer. The Australian contribution to victory in the West was enormous, although they paid a heavy price. Australian casualties numbered more than 81,000 after just 2 years of fighting, including 46,000 dead. The Royal Australian Navy was founded in 1911, only 3 years before the war began. By the time the war broke out, however, she had 16 ships, 3,800 officers, almost 1,650 reserves, and almost 3,100 cadets in training. While active in those initial landings on New Guinea, it wasn't until November that the RAN really announced itself. Responding to a distress call, the HMAS Sydney found itself facing down the German Emden craft. After taking damage, the Sydney brought her more powerful guns to bear, sinking the German vessel and causing great jubilation back in Australia. For the remainder of the war, the RAN would serve in East Africa, the Dardanelles Straits, and the blockade of Germany's high seas fleet. While the RAN was only in its infancy at the outbreak of war, the Australian Flying Corps barely even existed. The first flying squadron had been formed in 1912, but the Australian Aviation Corps and Central Flying School did not emerge until 1914. By 1915, however, Australian planes and crews were in action, supporting British forces fighting German and Ottoman forces in modern-day Iraq. When Lieutenant George Mertz was killed during the Battle of Nasiriyah in July, he became the first Australian pilot to lose his life. The Flying Corps remained involved right up until the end of the war, serving over the Western Front and experiencing both losses and victories. At Cambrai, several of No. 2 Squadron's 18 aircraft were destroyed or badly damaged. Captain Robert Ricky Little would become Australia's top ace of the war, notching up 47 victories before he himself was killed at Noa in May 1918. Those initial campaigns in New Guinea would be the closest the fighting ever got to Australia. Unlike in the Second World War, the nation was never directly threatened by an enemy, but the conflict would still have a profound impact on Australian society. Conscription and the role of women in Australian industry would cause significant political divisions over the following decades. Finding itself suddenly on a war footing, Australia's economy suffered greatly, although the Great Depression of the early 1930s proved far more damaging. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Australian involvement in World War I related to its status on the world stage. Though nominally independent, Australia was still largely under the yoke of the British Empire in 1914. But her role as combatant meant she sent her own delegation to take part in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. It would be the Second World War that launched Australia as a truly independent entity on the world stage. But those 4 bitter years from 1914 to 1918 gave the fledgling nation the foundation it needed to move forwards, albeit at a sickening cost.